Presenter and writer Matthew Stadlen and Molly Blackall, Global Affairs Correspondent at the iPaper. Great to see you. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
Thank you. Shall we kick off with the Sunday Times? Does PM blame me for welfare chaos? So this is Keir Starmer reacting to the fact that all of those big NATO summits, you know, the G7 meetings with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, really distracted from local Prime Minister, you know, the People's Prime Minister. He's not connecting with MPs, he's not connecting with voters, essentially.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. So this comes after another U-turn from Keir Starmer, which is something, sadly, he's become quite famous for. And that's on the welfare bill, which was a proposal to really cut back social security payments to people, including disabled people. And it had a massive rebellion from Labour MPs. It was more than 100 were threatening to vote against him and sort of tank the whole thing. He's now rowed back from where he was, and he's blaming that on the international pressure that he's under. So, as you mentioned, this week was the NATO summit in The Hague, where the UK was sort of hashing out details of its new defence spending target. They agreed there to spend 5% of GDP on defence, which is a huge headache, to be fair, for the government, because it's more than double what we're currently spending, and they've got to find that money from somewhere. So there were some tough negotiations there with Donald Trump from the US, etc. And he's basically saying, I was distracted by all of that. There was also what we saw in the Middle East, the attacks between Iran and Israel. On the one hand, I think you can understand why it is that that would put pressure on you. You know, these are incredibly difficult, complex, sensitive international issues. But at the same time, it's sort of the job of the PM to be able to balance the two, isn't it? He's not the first PM to have to deal with international crises at home and you know, domestic issues abroad, and domestic issues at home. And you think maybe that's part of the job description.
As someone who voted for this government, I have got my head in my hands at the moment, because he'd already given an interview to his...
And is it specifically, Matthew, because of the U-turns? Is it specifically because of the issue with Sue Gray or the freebies row that engulfed government?
We're coming into... Yes, we're coming up, right up to the one-year anniversary. I do not think it has been a good year for this government. It has done some good stuff, but the reason I've got my head in my hands, apart from the fact that it has been a very challenging start, and there's this sense that Labour wasn't quite ready for government and that they were so focused on not making mistakes in the build-up to the general election and being cautious that actually they took their eye off the ball of what are they going to achieve in their first 100 days, let alone their first year. The reason I've got my head in my hands this morning is because Starmer had already given an interview to Tom Baldwin in The Observer, his biographer, in which he had U-turned on things he had said recently. So, for example, the speech on immigration, which was supposed to be a flagship speech in which he talked about a nation of strangers, or we were being at risk of becoming a nation of strangers, he's now saying he didn't mean to say that. Now, I welcome the idea that he didn't really mean to say it, or he shouldn't have said it, he regretted it. But for a Prime Minister, a few weeks after making a keynote speech, to say actually he shouldn't have said what he said, the big headline point, I think is extraordinary. And now he's given this interview to the Sunday Times, in which he's saying, as you've already effectively pointed out, that he's not making excuses, but these are my excuses. And these are the sorts of things you might expect to see or read in a political memoir when someone is no longer Prime Minister. But this is the bloke who is in charge of the country during really tumultuous times, both at home and abroad. And I'm afraid it doesn't inspire confidence.
Well, that leads us really nicely then, doesn't it, onto the Sunday Express. The headline here is UK crying out for politicians with real principles. And this is from their chief political commentator, saying there's new polling that's suggesting that Nigel Farage is a politician people can connect with because he has a story. It's immigration, isn't it?
Largely.
That's his story.
Indeed.
And Keir Starmer then, therefore, doesn't have a story, hasn't communicated the story of Labour.
As you say, or as you suggest, storytelling is a really important part of government. And that's not being cynical. It's not just about comms. It's about knowing where you're going, knowing where you want to go, and telling the public, or trying to bring the public with you. The reason I picked this story is not because it's a particularly great scoop for a Sunday paper, for effectively them giving a platform to Farage for saying, I'd be a better Prime Minister than Keir Starmer. The reason I wanted to pick it is because there is this important point about Labour and Starmer, which is that I'm not convinced, and this is what the polling suggests here, that people really know what they stand for. And it says here in this front page story, fewer than 4 out of 10 say that they know really what the Prime Minister stands for. I mean, Kemi Badenoch fares even worse. But around 2/3, or almost 2/3 of voters say it is clear what Farage himself stands for. Now, I will just very briefly make my point, because I've been talking for a while, to make this point, and that is that the fact that people know what Farage stands for could be Farage's downfall, and indeed I hope it will be, because I don't think he stands for much that is good. But it is that sense that he does stand for something that, when you're in opposition, at least, is a very effective tool. Starmer, as Prime Minister, needs to find that magic juice quite quickly.
OK, who's to blame then, Molly?
I mean, there's going to be a lot of finger-pointing, isn't there, over Reform's rise? There was some polling which came out, I think it was this week, suggesting that they would win a majority in a general election.
Not an overall majority,
but they'd be the biggest party.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a pretty meteoric rise from where they have been in the past.
Party with 5 MPs.
And I think it's true that Farage would be very, very happy with a piece like this on the front page of a paper, which really sets out his stall. But it is true that he is quite successfully, clearly, capitalising on these issues that Starmer has that we've just talked about around U-turning. It gives someone else to come in with an alternative narrative. He's playing into this kind of, I'm straight talking, you know where I stand, which is exactly what Trump did, you know, to get in again in the US. And clearly it is effective. You know, I think it's true that Starmer came in to office, admittidly with a very large majority a year ago, on a platform which was more, we're not the Tories, than necessarily
They will, if the government were here, they would say, look, what we're doing right now is to lay the foundations, and the things that we're doing now will take time. But it's not washing with you.
Well, the problem with that is one of the ways in which they're supposedly laying the foundations is saving money. And they wanted to save about £5 billion on welfare. And now Starmer has been forced into what is effectively a U-turn, certainly major concessions. And that's not just damaging politically, it also raises the question of where are the £3 billion odd that they're no longer going to save because of this rebellion going to come from?
Well, one of the other ways they want to, you know, improve and lay the foundations for the future is the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Stores told to cut shoppers' calories. Obesity, you know, it's doubled since the 1990s. It costs the NHS £11 billion a year. It's a huge headache. But they think one of the ways to do this is to encourage supermarkets, I guess, to take on some of the responsibility.
Yeah, for sure. That's what they're sort of announcing this week. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is to see how differently this has been covered across the different newspapers, which may have their own political slants. The Sunday Telegraph, which we've got up here, is very critical of this policy. It's talking about it as a nanny state policy. Whereas if you look at a paper like the Mirror, which leans on the left, more pro-Starmer, they seem to think this is a great idea. The idea, as you say, is to sort of shift the onus back onto supermarkets. I mean, most people that you talk to, I think, do want to eat more healthily, they do want to live better lives, but they don't have the time and they don't have the money. And I think the idea here is that supermarkets will have to offer more fruit and veg, fewer salty, sugary snacks, with the aim of cutting, it says, up to 100 calories from the average shopping basket. I think, you know, if there is a way of making this more of a structural solution, rather than always putting the individual, you know, under the pressure to do it themselves, I think I can see the argument for that. But obviously the Telegraph can't. It says it's sort of limiting free choice.
It's a really tricky thing, and it's about this balance between the state, which runs our healthcare system and foots the bill, and the individual. But it's also the individual who pays taxes. So how do we get that balance right? Personal responsibility does matter.
Yeah, we're streeting Health Secretary on Trevor Phillips at 8:30. That's all from us for now. Join us after the break.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.